Greetings, friends. I am privileged to share a very powerful story with you today from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, beginning with the 13th verse. Now, when Jesus heard this, and what Jesus heard, by the way, is about the beheading of John the Baptist. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the gospel of our Lord. I wonder if you have ever, let's say you got home from a day at work or maybe on a trip, and you say something like, "Oh man, am I ever starving?" Right? Does that sound familiar? I think we've all probably said a phrase, something like that, which is really kind of, not really an authentic thing to say for most of us, right? Because probably what that means, even if you say, "Boy, I am hungry enough to eat a horse," if you've ever shared a statement like that, what that probably means is, "Boy, I forgot my afternoon snack today, and it's been a long 5 hours since lunch." Something like that. You know, hunger, it means different things to different people, doesn't it? Oftentimes, when we hear about, when we think about, when we read about food insecurity issues, hunger, we hear about the statistics, and we all know those, and we all hear those statistics, but we can't ever afford to forget that those statistics represent beloved children of God. And so we know that X number of hundreds or maybe even thousands of people, even in Madison County, are in that place of having some struggle, perhaps, some of them every single month around the 23rd or the 24th of the month, as we have grown to understand it, where people perhaps need to start making choices. Are they going to be able to pay their rent for this month, or can they only afford to buy food to feed their family, or figure out some kind of a hybrid approach to that with the help of others? We know that X number of millions of people in our country, in the United States, go to bed without enough food every night. Beyond that, on a global level, we know that 795 million people, according to the World Food Program, do not have enough food to lead a healthy, active life. And so on this hunger continuum, if at this end of that continuum is, "Oh my goodness, I'm hungry, I'm ready for my next meal," on the other end of that continuum of real hunger, we know that almost 7,000 people die every single day due to hunger-related causes on the face of this earth. You know, for most of us, I suspect, when our children were growing up, our hope and our prayer for them went along the lines of hoping that they will do well in school. Hoping and praying that they would make good friends who would be a positive influence in their life. Or perhaps even along the lines of, boy, I hope my child can score a goal in this soccer game for their self-esteem and affirmation. But for hundreds and thousands of mothers and fathers in many parts of the world, their hope, their prayer, is that their child might defy the odds and live to the age of 13. It's important to note that inequality as relates to food security and access has been a struggle, has been a challenge throughout history, not just in recent times. We know that. And in fact, if we look at the thousands of people who were with Jesus on that day, I suspect that a portion of them were well off economically. Many of them probably were kind of on the borderline. And there were probably a number of people, probably many people actually, who were impoverished, who had a difficult time getting food on a daily basis. But we know that they were all hungry for something. And that's why they were following Jesus. You know, sometimes I think we imagine this crowd and we see this amazing miracle, and it brings laughter, it brings joy and enthusiasm, this amazing miracle working Jesus. And sometimes I wonder if we almost consider this scene in such a way as though it's like, well, what do you want to do this weekend? You know, what can we do for entertainment? As though we were thinking, oh, the Doobie Brothers are on their summer across the country tour. Let's catch a concert, right? And enjoy a wonderful day trip like that. But that's not what this is about, right? Word has gotten around about Jesus, about his super compelling and amazing and hopeful vision that he is bringing to the people, that brings a whole new way of understanding and looking at a God of love and of mercy and of compassion and of hope. These masses are troubled and hurting and hungry and diseased people. And they're now turning out in great numbers, seeking this Jesus with a huge, vast hunger for what he can provide to them in many different ways. He was healing them. He was curing the sick. That's why they came. And so I wonder, some of you have been in a job or a profession where you'd go to a conference or a retreat or a workshop on occasion, or have an all-day meeting, and either at lunchtime or maybe later in the day you have that situation where it's time to break for lunch, right? And so people disperse and they go to the local bistro or a restaurant, or have that break for lunch at the cafe and come back happy and satisfied and with a full stomach, and maybe even drifting off into near nap mode into the afternoon. I always feel sorry for that first speaker of the afternoon after everybody's had lunch. The pressure's on for them to keep them engaged and energized as they are content and fed moving into the afternoon phase. This was not an option here. Number one, it was 2,000 plus years ago. Number two, it was a deserted place that they ended up. You see, Jesus seemed surprised. In fact, I think I would say, based on this passage, Jesus was actually perplexed. I think that's a good word. When his disciples, maybe even panicking a little bit, or fearful of mob behavior, they wanted to send the crowds away. And of course, they hadn't come prepared with food, because when they left their homes earlier that day, they had no idea that they were going to end up on this longer journey, on this longer time away. They just heard about and tried to get to the place where Jesus was going to be. And so, Jesus was not done with them yet, because they had need. And so he carried on with the biblical tradition, and we see out of the scriptures over and over again throughout history, this historic scriptural continuation of that, which is the most common biblical image for divine mercy, which is food. Hospitality is a part of that, but to feed somebody, in Genesis 1. We see it's a part of God's story right from the get-go. Plants and trees and fruit that God created to feed God's people. Ancient narratives throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, throughout the Old Testament, tell of God's providing food relief during famine for those who were impoverished. The Israelites had their memories of those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and of course the most amazing thing about that whole story was God's absolutely miraculous provision of food, which was called manna. God kept them alive in the wilderness. We look in the Old Testament and we find one religious rule after another, commanding the faithful, the followers of God, to share their food and be generous with the hungry and the poor. Christ was born in Bethlehem. And I wonder how many of you are aware that the word Bethlehem literally means house of bread. Well, as you know, John's Gospel calls Jesus the bread of life. When Jesus took literally that handful of loaves and fish, there was no abracadabra type of moment. There was no show to it, neon lights or an explosion with smoke or anything like that. No, the text tells us simply that he just looked up to heaven, he blessed, and he broke it, and the distribution began. Those words, that imagery, of course, is a preview of the ultimate upper room blessing and breaking on the eve of his death, which became the most extraordinary, life-giving meal throughout history. I read a story about a commercial aircraft that was getting ready for departure, but there was a logistical snafu, so the supplies that were supposed to come for refreshments for the passengers was not coming. And so the captain finally made an executive decision and decided that most of the passengers would rather just close up the aircraft and take off and fly to their destination than sit around and just wait for the provisions to come, which would have taken some time. But of course, what happened is that some passengers got a little ornery. I know we're talking about a little bag with a dozen peanuts, right? And maybe a can of soda, that sort of thing. But maybe some just felt they were entitled. They had purchased their airline travel ticket and it should come with those things, or maybe they hadn't had a chance to eat anything all day long, and so on. Well, one of the flight attendants could tell there was some tension among some of the passengers in the cabin. She saw what was happening and she figured she needs to step up and try and do something to manage this. And so she got on the microphone and she just started to talk, and she kind of started to make things up as she went, and she even lifted up some of her colleagues, the other flight attendants and crew, and starting with them, some of them had some packages of chips or cookies or that sort of thing in their own belongings that they had brought along on the ship. And so they started to share with passengers. And then some of the passengers participated in the same. Some people just needed something to eat, and pretty soon this was happening. Love was in the air. There was a contagious quality to it, and people were kind and caring all the way around because of her initiative, as if some kind of a natural disaster had been averted. Well, one of the passengers on the way out of the plane that day stopped to greet that flight attendant and thanked her for her leadership initiative and for her savvy in handling this. And her response, she smiled and she said, "You know what? Loaves and fishes still work." 15,000 people on that day tried to get a piece of Jesus. And so Jesus trusted God the Father and cared for people and God provided. And you know what? 12 baskets of leftovers in surplus were collected. Isn't that the story of God for a hungry world? God's generosity for those who hunger. Mercy multiplied. God provides. You know, we all are familiar with Habitat for Humanity, an amazing ministry organization that makes such a difference in providing affordable housing for a population group that otherwise would not be able to afford home ownership. And back in the early days of Habitat for Humanity, there was a small church in Cartersville, Georgia, and the members of that church were getting very enthused. They were getting very excited about trying to make a difference in a local Habitat for Humanity chapter that was just getting started in their county. And so they visited Habitat for Humanity's headquarters to better understand the mission and to tour the facilities and to kind of educate themselves. And they even were privileged to have a private meeting with the founder of Habitat, Millard Fuller. So they explained that they felt this was God's calling to them. They felt the drive to take this on, but they were rightfully concerned about kind of counting the cost before they would start the design and construction and the resources that were required. And so they asked him, how much money do you think we should have in the bank before we can get started? And as the story was told afterwards, Millard Fuller leaned into the group and in a very serious, quiet voice, he said, I believe that it would be wholly irresponsible, feather-brained, and negligent if you started an affiliate without having at least $1. He said, don't make a move without it. And of course, that cracked everybody up. But his point was, God is God. I think, for our own kind of limited, sometimes human understanding purposes, I suppose it's helpful for us to kind of get things a little bit better, to better understand the amazing works of God. When we see a story like this, the Habitat story, but also the Jesus story of feeding the thousands, when we see a story where God has something to work with, like, for instance, $1, it's a place to start, or like 5 loaves and 2 fish, or like a mustard seed. Just look at what God can make out of this, or multiply from this. God can make a lot out of a little. But really, seriously, I suspect that the biblical imagery plays out that way because we have such limited imaginations. As if God, the creator of this entire universe, needs something or needs us to provide something in order to get his work done. We know that in the creation story, God created ex nihilo, which is Latin for out of nothing. It's important for us to be reminded that, especially for this next point. I believe it's really relevant for our consideration, for our edification, which is this. While God may not be in need of other elements to get his work done, nevertheless, God expects that his disciples will respond to his call. One can imagine on that day Jesus looking around and thinking, oh my goodness, these people have come to be cared for. They have come to find hope, to hear good news. They've come for healing. They're hungry for so much. Don't send them on their way. He said to his disciples, and he still says that to you and to me today. You give them something to eat. You make something happen out of this. You respond to this human need. And he says, and I will bless you, and I will bless those that you touch. I want to lift up one specific focus that is really an important and key component to this story. I don't want to just gloss over it because it's easy for us to overlook, but something important for us to think about. In this passage here, we read it, Jesus did not want to be there. It wasn't his plan to be among all of those people. See, as we need to remember, Jesus had just learned about the horrific death of John the Baptist. Not only had John just been put to death, but it was a gruesome killing at the hands of Herod. And so Jesus was full of grief. John was his cousin. John was his dear and good friend. John is the one who put his life on the line to prepare the way of Jesus coming into this world. And so Jesus was weary and suffering this loss, grieving, and he desired to be alone. Withdrawing in a boat, Jesus had gone to a deserted place, the text says, but it just wasn't to be. The crowds came. The crowds who were so hungry for him learned about what direction he was going. They even beat him there. We see it here when Jesus came to the shore in verse 14. He saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. So carrying that load of personal grief and yet acting on that higher calling to love and to serve in the midst of it, that's our calling too. Some of you are grieving these days. Some of you are in a lonely place, not by design, but because of a pandemic and because of life circumstances and because you've outlived your spouse or because that's just the way it is. And so it might be a lonely place to you, but God's calling still comes through, doesn't it? To serve and to feed. One final story. There was a man by the name of Albert Schmidt who was a good family friend of a family who had just lost their 8-year-old son. And so he was in the home of this family, which included a little 5-year-old boy by the name of George. George had just witnessed the burial at the cemetery of his 7-year-old brother. In fact, little George was so distraught at the gravesite that he wanted to jump into the grave himself. He was just beyond himself. He didn't know how to manage this. How can a 5-year-old deal with the death of his older brother? And so this agonized time, and now they were at home with family and friends who had gathered. It was a very somber time, of course, after the burial. And so this little George kind of buried himself, in a manner of speaking, Albert said, with blankets he dragged with him and slid underneath the bed of his brother. He wouldn't come out. He declared that he would never come out. He was so angry with life and with the world, and his mother and family members, people tried to coax him out and to bribe him out, and nothing worked. And finally, this Albert, the family friend, who was quite close to George, he said that the Lord kind of got his attention with a 2x4 as he realized it was not his job to get George out of that place. Rather, it was his job to go to George. And so Albert, who was a pretty big man, got down on the floor. He slid and squeezed underneath that bed frame. He said he nearly punctured and shredded his chest on the bed springs from the bottom of the bed above him. And he said to that grief-stricken little boy, George, he said, "Well, George, if you are going to stay here for the rest of your life, then by golly," he said, "I am going to stay here with you." He described what happened next. First of all, he said, was about 15 minutes of eternity. But then finally, George decided that they should together crawl out and join the rest of the folks. And George's mother, who, remember, had just buried her other son, she came and exercised the gift of hospitality and care and served them cookies and milk. And Albert said it felt like a sacramental meal of hope. Friends in Jesus, may the Lord God Almighty empower you to serve, to feed all manner of hungry people, in order that we can share the taste of the hope that comes from Jesus, just as he has fed us out of God's love and grace. Amen.